Simple common sense. One of the most controversial and divisive questions in Australia today is whether or not the government should allow same-sex marriage or gay marriage. It keeps coming up in the media, and it seems like every man and his dog has his opinion. The problem is that these opinions don't line up with each other. Often they are so contradictory, you don't know what to think. For example, you hear the following statements made by intelligent Australians. Love is love, and that's all that's important as far as marriage is concerned. Same-sex marriage is the biggest social experiment of our generation, and no one knows the long-term effects. Preventing same-sex couples from marrying is discrimination, so we must allow marriage equality. Same-sex marriage will profoundly affect families, children, and society, and not for the better. In addition, rather than having a civilized, in-depth discussion about the issue, we see the following. The media constantly bombarding us with sound bites and slogans that are often meaningless. There is no in-depth discussion at a level the average Australian can understand. The pro-gay marriage campaign often presents anyone who disagrees with them as a bigot or a hater. With all this going on, how can the average Australian make an informed decision? Well, the truth is they can't. So in the end, it becomes just too hard. They then adopt that age-old default position that people use when things get too hard. They stick their head in the sand. Unfortunately, there are several problems with doing this. The fundamental building block of society is the family, and marriage is the glue that holds families together. Any change to marriage profoundly affects families and therefore children. By the time we see these effects, however, it's too late to reverse them. We only need to look at the last time we messed with marriage, no-fault divorce laws. This affected a whole generation of kids, and the government is still spending billions of dollars a year on family breakdown. So, before we go and do that again, let's look at the question of whether we should allow same-sex marriage in a logical and systematic way and using several types of evidence. We can look at what history tells us, what science tells us, and the logic behind marriage equality. Then let's use some simple common sense to make the best decision. We have 5,000 years of recorded human history to show us how marriage has changed and what has stayed the same. First, we need to look at some basic facts that are true of all cultures throughout history. Any society that survives must have a steady flow of babies to replace people that die. These babies then must grow up into responsible members of society. Male-female sex is the cheapest and most effective way to make babies. These babies then need nearly 20 years of care from both mother and father to become responsible members of society. Marriage is the institution that keeps mother and father together to provide the best environment to raise these kids. So across the world and across history, all cultures have used male-female marriage to raise children and thus maintain their societies. In fact, we can trace the beginning of human civilization to the beginning of the institution of marriage. Therefore, male-female marriage has always been the foundation of human civilization. This is simple common sense. Next, let's look at what the social sciences tell us about the issue. We have more than 4 decades of high-quality statistical research to draw on, and it tells us several clear facts. Mothers and fathers bring unique benefits to kids, and they're not interchangeable. Kids need both a mum and a dad. Family breakdown and the absence of fathers has had profoundly negative impact on kids. Now, there are a few studies that say that kids raised by same-sex couples do just as well as other kids, but a closer examination of these studies shows us that they are of such poor quality that we can't draw any meaningful conclusions from them. We now have a number of large, good quality studies regarding this issue, and they all say the same thing, that kids raised by same-sex couples do not do as well as those raised by married biological parents. So science tells us the same thing that history tells us, that the best environment to raise children is with married mother and father. This is simple common sense. Now, let's look at the logic behind the idea that legalizing same-sex marriage will mean marriage equality. Basically, they say that we are discriminating against same-sex couples when we don't allow them to marry. There are several problems with this argument, however. You can only have equality when you have 2 or more equally qualified alternatives. It's not discrimination when you make a distinction between things that are not equally qualified. In fact, employers do this every day in job interviews when they choose the one candidate best qualified to fulfill the requirements of the position. So whatever we call marriage must be able to fulfill the purpose of marriage, which is to create and raise the next generation. So using the job interview analogy, we could call this the requirements of the position for marriage. No one denies that same-sex couples love each other, but marriage is not just about love. If marriage was only about love and depth of feeling, why should the government care whom you marry? Many friendships involve depth of feeling and even love, but the government doesn't dictate who you can be friends with. Why? Answer: the only reason that governments get involved in marriage in the first place is because, as a rule, children come from marriages and governments are obliged to make sure that these kids are looked after. This is the reason that governments, not churches or friends, collect child support payments. So, regardless of their love and feelings for each other, same-sex couples must still fulfill the requirements of the position for marriage. Just as only the one person best qualified to fulfill the requirements of the position gets the job, only the one arrangement best qualified to fulfill the requirements of the position gets to be called marriage. If we are going to make a truly valid comparison, we must compare apples with apples. This means we must compare the best of one with the best example of another. So we cannot compare the best example of a same-sex couple with the worst example of an opposite-sex couple. Also, we must compare the rule rather than the exception. We need to look at what usually happens with one with what usually happens with another. For example, all the medical evidence tells us that smoking usually causes many health problems. So, even though there might be the unusual exception of the person who smoked a packet a day and lived to be 100, doctors still tell us not to smoke. Having gone through the logic, let's look at the facts. Fact: laws have already been changed to give same-sex couples all the same rights as opposite-sex de facto relationships, so there's no real discrimination. Fact: even though intelligent adults try to tell us that a male-male pair is the same as a male-female couple, even a child can tell you that they are not the same. It's just like in the fairy tale, The Emperor's New Clothes. It took the simplicity of a child to expose the delusion of the adults. Fact: just because there is a small percentage of marriages that do not produce children does not change the reality that the vast majority do and have done so for thousands of years. Infertility is the exception and doesn't change the rule that the purpose of marriage is to create and raise the next generation. Fact: comparing failed or abusive male-female marriages with loving, committed, same-sex couples is not a valid comparison. When we compare apples with apples, that is, the best of same-sex couples with the best of married biological parents, we see that the outcomes are clearly different. Fact: same-sex couples by themselves cannot provide for society what a male-female couple can. They cannot create and raise the next generation. Indeed, if same-sex marriage was the norm for our society, we'd have no society left. Therefore, they cannot fulfill the requirements of the position. So there really is only one arrangement that best fulfills the requirements of the position for marriage. That's one man and one woman. So we have no equally qualified alternative. Therefore, there's no such thing as marriage equality. So, in reality, saying that marriage should remain between one man and one woman, it's not discrimination, it's just simple common sense. In conclusion, all the evidence tells us that marriage is a unique institution and only has one arrangement that fulfills its functions. That's one man and one woman. Good law should not only be fair and equitable, but it should also be based on the best evidence. Therefore, keeping marriage between one man and one woman just makes simple common sense.